The first scream didn't come from a child. It came from the earth itself. Or so it seemed to Deputy Elias Thorne as he stood in the mud-choked yard of the Sullivan estate, rain lashing his oilskin coat like the lashes of a vengeful god. The storm had rolled in fast, unnaturally fast, just as the sun dipped below the Blue Ridge Mountains, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise. Thunder cracked overhead, not with the usual rumble of distant fury, but with a sharp, splintering crack that echoed through the hollow like a gunshot. And then, beneath the roar of the downpour and the groan of ancient oaks bending in the wind, came that sound. A low, guttural moan rising from the ground beneath his boots. Not human, not animal, something older, something wrong. Elias froze, his hand instinctively going to the worn grip of his pistol. He'd been sent here on a fool's errand, or so he'd thought. A missing persons report filed by a nervous shopkeeper in Lynchburg. 3 children, all from poor families, had vanished over the past month. No bodies, no ransom notes, just gone. And all 3 had last been seen near the crossroads leading to the Sullivan property. The Sullivans, reclusive, wealthy, untouchable. Their name alone was enough to make sheriffs look the other way and magistrates clear their throats and change the subject. But Elias, a man with a dead wife and a conscience that wouldn't let him sleep, had pushed. He'd ridden through the storm, past fields of withered tobacco and fences sagging with neglect, to this decaying manor house perched on the edge of Blackroot Hollow. Now, standing before the house, a hulking silhouette of weathered brick and sagging shutters, he felt the weight of its silence. No lights in the windows, no smoke from the chimneys, no dogs barking, just that terrible, subterranean groan, vibrating up through the soles of his boots, setting his teeth on edge. He'd seen horrors in the War of 1812, men torn apart by cannon fire, villages burned to ash, but this felt different. This felt calculated. This felt like evil wearing a human face. He took a step forward, his boots sinking into the mud. The groan deepened, resolving into a chorus of faint, rhythmic clinks, like chains, like metal scraping on stone. His blood turned to ice. He drew his pistol, the cold iron a small comfort against the suffocating dread pressing in from the storm and the house and the earth itself. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed thought and settled deep in his gut, that he was standing on the threshold of something unspeakable, something that would shatter the fragile peace of Virginia and leave a stain on his soul that no amount of rain could ever wash away. He didn't know it yet, but he was standing above the basement where 47 children were found chained. Blackroot Hollow wasn't on most maps. It was a forgotten place, a scar in the Virginia landscape carved by a long dry river and choked with dense, primordial forest. The locals, those few who still lived in the scattered cabins clinging to the hillsides, spoke of it in hushed tones. They called it the Devil's Throat, for the way the wind howled through its deepest ravines, or Widow's Weep, for the mournful sound the pines made at dusk. Superstition clung to the hollow like Spanish moss. Tales of restless spirits, of witches who danced under the blood moon, of a curse laid upon the land by a wronged Cherokee shaman generations ago. Most sensible folks gave it a wide berth. The Sullivan family, however, had not only settled in the hollow, they had claimed it. Silas Sullivan, the patriarch, had arrived in the late 1790s, a man of imposing stature and colder eyes, with a fortune rumored to be built on the backs of slaves and the ruthless acquisition of land. He'd bought up vast tracts of the hollow for pennies on the dollar, land deemed worthless by others because of the stories. He built his manor house on the highest ridge, a fortress of brick and arrogance overlooking the valley, a constant, silent challenge to the superstitions below. He married Eleanor Vance, a woman from a respectable Lynchburg family, whose beauty was said to be matched only by her melancholy. They had one son, Alastair, born in 1801. For decades, the Sullivans lived in isolated splendor. They employed a handful of servants, mostly freedmen and poor whites desperate for work, but kept to themselves. Silas was rarely seen in town, and when he was, his presence was marked by a chilling formality and an aura of absolute control. He donated generously to the church and the county, ensuring his name was spoken with respect, if not warmth. He was a pillar of the community, in the way a stone gargoyle is a pillar of a cathedral, ornamental, imposing, and fundamentally unsettling. But whispers persisted. Whispers about the lights seen in the basement windows long after the rest of the house was dark. Whispers about the strange, acrid smell that sometimes drifted down from the ridge on the night wind. A smell like burnt hair and chemicals. Whispers about the children. Started small. A farmer's boy who wandered too far from his chores and never came home. A little girl sent to fetch water from the creek who vanished without a trace. The disappearances were infrequent at first, easily dismissed as tragic accidents or runaways. Virginia in 1834 was a vast, untamed place, and children, especially poor ones, were often considered expendable. But the pattern was there, if one cared to look. All the missing children were from the poorest families, with no powerful relatives to demand answers. All had last been seen near the edges of Sullivan Land. Sheriff Harlan Briggs, a man whose loyalty was bought and paid for with Sullivan gold, filed the reports and closed the cases with bureaucratic efficiency. Lost in the woods, he'd say, or likely drowned in the creek. The grieving parents, powerless and broken, had no recourse. The hollow swallowed their sorrow, just as it had swallowed their children. Alastair Sullivan grew up in this atmosphere of quiet dread and unspoken power. He was a sickly child, pale and thin, with his mother's large, haunted eyes and his father's unnerving stillness. He rarely played with other children. His education was conducted by private tutors who came and went with alarming frequency, often leaving before their contracts were up, muttering about unnatural studies and the boys' disturbing questions. Alastair showed an early, obsessive fascination with anatomy, with the mechanics of life and death. He would spend hours in the family's overgrown greenhouse, dissecting insects and small animals with meticulous, almost loving care. His father watched him with a strange pride, a glint of something predatory in his eyes. When Silas Sullivan died in 1825, ostensibly of a sudden apoplexy, the mantle of the Sullivan estate passed to the 24-year-old Alastair. The locals expected the young man to sell the decaying property and move to Richmond or Charleston, to shed the Hollow's grim reputation like a soiled coat. But Alastair did the opposite. He retreated deeper into the manor, reinforcing its isolation. He dismissed most of the remaining servants, keeping only a skeletal staff, a hulking groundskeeper named Jedediah Crow, whose face was a roadmap of old scars, and a silent, bird-like housekeeper named Mrs. Gable, who moved through the halls like a ghost. The disappearances, which had slowed during Silas's final, ailing years, began again. Not just one or two children now, but a steady, horrifying trickle. And the whispers grew louder, bolder. People started locking their doors at dusk. Parents kept their children close, their eyes darting nervously towards the ridge where the Sullivan Manor brooded against the sky. It was into this climate of fear and suspicion that Deputy Elias Thorne arrived. He was not a native of the Hollow. He'd come to Lynchburg 5 years prior, a widower seeking a fresh start after the fever took his young wife, Clara. He was a man of quiet integrity, with a face weathered by grief and sun, and eyes that held a deep, abiding sadness. He joined the sheriff's department not for glory, but because he needed a purpose, a way to fight the darkness that threatened to consume him. He'd heard the whispers about the Sullivans, of course. Everyone had. But he'd dismissed them as the superstitious ramblings of backwoods folk, until the Henderson boy vanished. Thomas Henderson was 10 years old, the son of a widow who ran a small dry goods store on the edge of Lynchburg. He was a bright, cheerful boy, well-liked by everyone. He'd been sent to deliver a package to a farm on the outskirts of town, a farm that bordered Sullivan Land. He never returned. His mother, frantic, had come to the sheriff's office, her face streaked with tears. Sheriff Briggs had patted her hand, offered platitudes, and filed the report under lost. But Elias, watching the raw terror in the woman's eyes, couldn't let it go. He remembered Clara's face in her final days, the same helpless fear. He began to ask questions, quietly at first, then more insistently. He learned about the other disappearances. He tracked down the grieving parents, listened to their stories. The pattern was undeniable, and it all led back to the Sullivan estate. When he took his findings to Sheriff Briggs, the man's face had hardened into a mask of cold fury. "You're chasing shadows, Thorne," Briggs had hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "The Sullivans are pillars of this community. You start poking your nose into their business, you'll find yourself unemployed, or worse. Drop it, for your own sake." But Elias couldn't drop it. The image of Thomas Henderson's mother, her hands twisting her apron into knots, haunted him. So, on that storm-lashed evening in October 1834, with the sky weeping and the wind screaming through the trees, he rode out to Blackroot Hollow alone, armed with nothing but his pistol, his badge, and a desperate, gnawing certainty that something monstrous was happening on that ridge. And now, standing in the mud before the silent house, hearing that awful subterranean groan and the faint, metallic clink, he knew he was right. The front door of the Sullivan Manor was unlocked. It swung open with a slow, protesting creak that sounded unnaturally loud in the storm's fury. Elias stepped inside, his pistol held low and ready, his senses straining against the oppressive silence. The air inside was thick and stale, smelling of dust, mildew, and that same acrid chemical tang he'd smelled from outside. Stronger now, almost choking. It was the smell of formaldehyde and decay, a smell he associated with the battlefield morgues. The grand foyer was a monument to faded grandeur. A massive chandelier, its crystals dulled by grime, hung from a ceiling lost in shadow. Portraits of stern-faced Sullivans lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow him as he moved. The furniture was covered in yellowed sheets, like shrouds over corpses. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust, undisturbed for weeks, maybe months. Yet the air felt occupied, as if the house itself was holding its breath. He moved cautiously through the rooms on the ground floor, parlor, dining room, library. All empty, all meticulously clean in their abandonment, as if someone had swept away all evidence of life but left the shell behind. In the library, he found shelves lined with books on anatomy, surgery, alchemy, and obscure theological texts. One volume, bound in what looked like human skin, lay open on a heavy oak desk. The pages were filled with dense, spidery handwriting and intricate, disturbing diagrams of the human body, with organs labeled in Latin and strange symbols. One diagram showed a child's skeleton overlaid with lines of force, converging on the heart. Another depicted a complex array of chains and pulleys connected to a prone figure. Elias's stomach churned. This wasn't just the study of a curious man. This was the blueprint of a madman. He found the stairs to the basement in the kitchen. A heavy, iron-banded door set into the stone floor, its handle cold and slick with condensation. The groaning sound was louder here, a constant, low thrum that vibrated in his bones. The clinking of chains was clearer too, a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the storm above. He could hear something else now, a faint, collective whimper, so low it was almost subliminal, like the buzzing of flies. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle. This was it, the point of no return. He thought of Clara, of the promise he'd made to himself to be a good man, to stand against the darkness. He thought of Thomas Henderson's mother. He took a deep breath, the chemical stench burning his nostrils, and pulled the door open. A wave of cold, damp air rushed up from the darkness below, carrying with it the full, horrifying symphony of sounds. The groan, the clink, the whimper, and now, unmistakably, the sound of labored breathing. Dozens of breaths, shallow, rapid, terrified. A narrow stone staircase descended into blackness. There was no light. Elias fumbled in his coat for a box of lucifers. His fingers were numb with cold and fear. He struck one. The tiny flame sputtered, then caught, casting a small, trembling circle of light on the rough-hewn stone walls slick with moisture. He started down, each step echoing in the confined space, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling deeper into the earth. The air grew colder, damper, the chemical smell mingling with the stench of unwashed bodies, human waste, and something else, something metallic and sweet. Blood. He reached the bottom. The match burned low, threatening to gutter out. He held it high, and the light spilled out into the vast chamber before him. What he saw froze the blood in his veins. He was standing on a narrow ledge overlooking a cavernous basement, easily the size of a small church. The ceiling was lost in shadow, supported by thick stone pillars. The floor below was a nightmare landscape of iron and stone. Dozens of crude, rusted cages lined the walls, each barely large enough for a child to sit hunched over. But it was the center of the room that held his horrified gaze. There, arranged in a perfect, concentric circle, were 47 iron rings bolted into the stone floor. From each ring snaked a heavy chain, terminating in manacles locked around the ankle of a child. They were all ages, from toddlers barely able to stand to adolescents on the cusp of adulthood. Boys and girls, black and white, their clothes were rags, their bodies thin and covered in sores and bruises. Their eyes, wide and vacant with terror, reflected the tiny flame of his match like the eyes of cornered animals. They were utterly silent now, frozen in place, staring up at him with a mixture of hope and unimaginable fear. The whimpering had stopped. The only sounds were the drip of water from the ceiling, the crackle of the match, and the soft, constant clink of chains as the children shifted minutely in their bonds. Elias's mind reeled. 47. The number was seared into his brain. 47 children, chained like animals in the bowels of the earth. The sheer, monstrous scale of it defied comprehension. Who could do this? Why? His match burned down to his fingers. He dropped it with a hiss, plunging the chamber back into near-total darkness. A collective gasp rose from the children, a wave of pure, animal panic. He heard the frantic rattle of chains as they tried to scramble back, to hide from the returning darkness. "No!" Elias cried, his voice cracking. "It's all right. I'm here to help you." He fumbled for another lucifer, his hands shaking so badly he dropped it twice before he could strike it. The light flared again, and he saw their faces more clearly now. The hollow cheeks, the matted hair, the eyes that held lifetimes of suffering in their young depths. One little girl, no older than 5, was sucking her thumb, her eyes fixed on him with a desperate, silent plea. A boy of maybe 12 had a deep, festering gash on his arm, crawling with maggots. He had to get them out. Out. But how? The chains were thick, bolted deep into the stone. He had no tools. And where was Alistair Sullivan? Where was Jedediah Crow? The house had seemed empty, but this operation required constant oversight. They had to be here somewhere. As if summoned by his thoughts, a voice echoed from the far end of the chamber, smooth as oiled silk and cold as the grave. "Deputy Thorne." How unexpected. Elias spun, raising his pistol, the matchlight casting long, dancing shadows. Standing in an arched doorway he hadn't noticed before was Alistair Sullivan. He was taller than Elias had imagined, unnaturally thin, draped in a long black coat that seemed to absorb the feeble light. His face was pale as marble, with sharp, aristocratic features and eyes that were a startling, almost luminous blue. They held no madness, no rage, only a chilling, detached curiosity, like a scientist observing a particularly interesting specimen. In his hand, he held not a weapon, but a small, leather-bound book. "You've stumbled upon my sanctuary," Alistair said, his voice calm, almost conversational. He took a step forward, his boots clicking softly on the stone. "My life's work. Your life's work." Elias's voice was a hoarse whisper, his pistol trained on Alistair's chest. "You monster. You've chained these children like dogs." Alistair tilted his head, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "Chained? No, deputy. They are anchored to the source, to the power." He gestured vaguely towards the center of the circle. "You see, the human soul, particularly the soul of a child, it possesses a unique vibrancy, a purity of energy that is malleable. My father understood this. He began the work. I have perfected it." Elias's mind raced. This wasn't just kidnapping. This was something far darker, far more insane. What power? What are you talking about? The power to transcend, Alistair said, his eyes gleaming with a fanatical light. To shed this frail, decaying flesh, to become something more. My father sought it through alchemy, through the transmutation of base metals. A noble pursuit, but flawed. The true transmutation, deputy, is of the spirit, and it requires a catalyst, a focal point of immense, concentrated life force. He took another step closer. Elias could smell the chemical stench stronger on him now, mixed with the faint, sweet odor of decay. These children, their fear, their pain, their very life essence, it resonates, creates a field I can harness. I have been conducting experiments, refining the process. Each one brings me closer, closer to the threshold. You're insane? Elias breathed, his finger tightening on the trigger. You're torturing and murdering children for some delusion. Murder. Alistair's smile widened, showing small, even teeth. No, deputy. I am liberating them. Their suffering serves a higher purpose. Their sacrifice will pave the way for a new understanding of existence. Isn't that a noble end? Before Elias could respond, a heavy tread sounded on the stairs behind him. He whirled, but it was too late. A massive hand clamped down on his shoulder, crushing the bone. Jedediah Crow loomed over him, his scarred face twisted in a cruel grin, his breath reeking of rotgut whiskey. In his other hand, he held a heavy iron pry bar. Told you he'd come sniffing around, Master Alistair? Crow growled, his voice like gravel in a tin can. He wrenched the pistol from Elias's grasp with terrifying ease and tossed it into the darkness. Then, with a brutal shove, he sent Elias sprawling onto the stone floor, right at the edge of the circle of chains. Elias landed hard, the breath knocked out of him. He looked up, dazed, to see Alistair standing over him. His blue eyes filled with a terrible clinical interest. Fascinating, Alistair murmured. The arrival of an outsider, an unanchored soul. It creates a disruption in the field, a variable I had not anticipated. He knelt down, his movements unervingly graceful, and picked up the fallen matchbox from where Elias had dropped it. He struck a lucifer himself, holding it close to Elias's face. The light flickered in his eyes, turning them into pools of cold fire. Tell me, deputy, do you feel it? The hum? The pull? Elias did feel it. Now that he was on the floor, within the circle, the groaning vibration was stronger, a physical pressure against his skin. It felt like the earth itself was breathing, and the breath was poisoned. He could feel the terror radiating from the children, a palpable wave of despair that made his own fear seem insignificant. You won't get away with this, Elias gasped, struggling to sit up. People will come looking for me. Alistair chuckled softly, a dry, rustling sound. People? The sheriff? He is a well-paid puppet. And who else would dare come to Blackroot Hollow? No, deputy. You are as trapped as they are. Perhaps you can join the experiment. Your soul, seasoned by grief and duty, it might provide a unique resonance. He nodded to Crow. The giant stepped forward, his shadow falling over Elias like a shroud. Elias braced himself for the blow, for the cold bite of iron manacles on his own ankle. But then, from the darkness near the stairs, a new sound emerged. Not a whimper, not a groan, a song. It was faint at first, a child's voice, thin and trembling, singing a simple, haunting melody. Hush now, baby. Don't you cry. Another voice joined in, then another. A chorus of young, broken voices rising from the circle of chains, singing the old lullaby with a desperate, defiant hope. Alistair's head snapped up, his expression shifting from curiosity to annoyance. Silence them, Crow, he hissed. But the song grew louder, stronger, weaving through the chamber, pushing back against the oppressive hum of the basement. The children, emboldened by Elias's presence, by the sight of another adult who wasn't their tormentor, were finding their voices. Their collective will, their shared humanity, was becoming a weapon. Elias saw his chance. While Alistair was distracted, glaring at the singing children, Elias lunged. Not at Alistair, but at Crow's legs. He tackled the giant's knees with all his strength. Crow roared in surprise and pain, stumbling backwards. His head cracked against the stone pillar with a sickening thud, and he collapsed, unconscious. Alistair whirled back, his face contorted in fury. "You fool!" he snarled, drawing a long, thin-bladed knife from his coat. He lunged at Elias. Elias scrambled backwards, his hand closing on something cold and heavy in the darkness. A discarded chain. He swung it wildly, the heavy iron links catching Alistair across the face. The man screamed, more in outrage than pain, stumbling back, blood welling from a gash on his cheek. The singing faltered, then stopped. The children watched, wide-eyed, as the two men grappled in the flickering light. Elias knew he couldn't win a straight fight. Alistair was faster, and he had the knife. He had to end this. Now, he remembered the iron rings bolted into the floor. He remembered Alistair's words, anchored to the source. With a desperate heave, Elias threw the chain he was holding, not at Alistair, but at the nearest iron ring. The heavy links wrapped around it with a loud clang. The effect was instantaneous. The groaning hum in the chamber spiked into a deafening shriek. The very air seemed to vibrate, crackling with static electricity. Alistair cried out, clutching his head as if in agony. The knife fell from his hand, clattering on the stone. "What have you done?" he shrieked, his voice raw with terror. "You've disrupted the matrix. You've broken the anchor." The chains holding the children began to rattle violently, not from their movement, but from some unseen force. The iron rings in the floor glowed with a faint, sickly green light. The air grew thick, heavy, charged with a malevolent energy. Elias didn't understand the science or the sorcery of it, but he understood one thing. The system was failing, and in its failure, it might be their only chance. "Get up!" he yelled to the children, his voice cutting through the din. "Get up and run. The chains, they're loose." It was a gamble, a desperate lie, but it worked. Seeing their captor writhing on the floor, seeing the strange energy flickering around the rings, the children found a surge of courage. They began to pull at their chains, not with the weak, hopeless tugs of before, but with the frantic strength of the damned seeing a sliver of light. And miraculously, some of the chains did loosen. The bolts holding the rings, stressed by the unnatural energies Alistair had been channeling, were shearing. One ring popped free from the stone with a shower of sparks. Then another. The chain attached to it went slack. A little boy, the one with the maggot-infested wound, was the first to break free. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild, and stumbled towards the stairs. His movement broke the spell of fear. Other children, seeing him run, redoubled their efforts. The chamber became a scene of chaotic, desperate liberation. Children were pulling chains free, helping each other. Their whimpers replaced by gasps of effort and cries of, "This way!" Alistair, recovering from his momentary agony, saw his sanctuary collapsing, his life's work unraveling before his eyes. Rage and despair twisted his features into a mask of pure evil. He snatched up his knife and lunged, not at Elias, but at the nearest child, a small girl who was struggling with her chain. Elias didn't think. He threw himself between them. The knife plunged into his side, just below the ribs. White-hot pain exploded through him, stealing his breath. He fell to his knees, clutching the wound, warm blood soaking through his coat. Alistair stood over him, panting, the knife dripping red. "You've ruined everything," he whispered, his voice trembling with fury and loss. But Elias wasn't looking at him. He was looking past him at the stairs. The first children were already reaching the top, their small figures silhouetted against the storm-lit doorway. More were following, a tide of ragged, terrified humanity flowing towards freedom. And then, from the top of the stairs, a new voice boomed, cutting through the chaos. "Sullivan, drop the blade." Sheriff Harlan Briggs stood in the doorway, his own pistol drawn, his face pale but resolute. Behind him, silhouetted by the lightning flashes, were half a dozen armed men. Townsfolk, farmers, the Henderson boy's mother among them, her face set in grim determination. They'd followed Elias. They'd seen the unlocked door. They'd heard the screams. Alistair froze, his eyes darting from the escaping children to the armed men at the stairs, to Elias bleeding at his feet. The realization hit him: his world was ending. His power was gone. His sanctuary was violated. With a sound that was part sob, part snarl, he turned and fled, not up the stairs, but into the dark archway he'd emerged from, the doorway to his private laboratory. He disappeared into the deeper darkness beyond. Sheriff Briggs rushed down the stairs, his men following, spreading out to secure the chamber. He knelt beside Elias, his face grim. "Hold on, Thorne. Help's coming." But Elias's eyes were on the children. He watched as the last of them, the little girl who had started the song, was helped up the stairs by a burly farmer. She looked back once, her eyes meeting Elias's. In them, he saw not just terror, but a flicker of something else. Gratitude, hope. Then the world went black. Elias Thorne awoke to the sound of rain. Not the violent lashing of the storm, but a gentle, steady patter on a roof. He was in a bed, in a clean, white room that smelled of herbs and lye soap. Sunlight, weak but real, filtered through a window. He was alive. The pain in his side was a deep, throbbing ache, but it was clean, dressed with bandages. He tried to sit up, but a gentle hand pressed him back down. "Easy now, deputy," said a calm, familiar voice. It was Dr. Evans, the town physician. "You took a nasty stab wound. Lost a lot of blood. You've been out for 2 days. The children," Elias croaked, his throat dry as dust. "Safe," Dr. Evans said, his voice softening. "All 47 of them. We got them out. They're being cared for. Federal cleaned. It'll take time. A long time. But they're alive. Thanks to you." Relief, so profound it was almost painful, washed over Elias. He closed his eyes, tears leaking from the corners. 47. They were safe. What happened to Sullivan?" he asked after a moment. Dr. Evans's face darkened. "Gone. Vanished. When Briggs and his men went into that laboratory, it was a charnel house. Jars with things floating in them. Notes, diagrams, evidence of unspeakable acts. But Sullivan was gone. There was a tunnel, they think, leading out into the woods. He must have escaped during the chaos." Elias felt a cold dread seep into his bones, colder than the knife wound. Alistair Sullivan was still out there, and he would be back. Men like that didn't just disappear. They festered. They plotted. The days that followed were a blur of pain, interrogation, and overwhelming grief. Elias told his story to Sheriff Briggs, to the county magistrate, to anyone who would listen. The evidence from the basement was overwhelming. The chains, the cages, the laboratory, the journals filled with Alistair's mad ramblings about soul resonance and transcendental anchoring. The Sullivan's name, once a shield, became a brand of infamy. The estate was seized by the county. The groundskeeper, Jedediah Crow, recovered from his head wound only to be thrown into the Lynchburg jail, where he refused to speak, his eyes vacant and broken. The town of Lynchburg, and indeed all of Virginia, was rocked to its core. Newspapers from Richmond to New York carried the story. The horror of Blackroot Hollow, 47 children rescued from Devil's Lair. The details were too grotesque for most papers to print in full, but the gist was enough to ignite a firestorm of outrage and fear. Vigilante groups formed, scouring the woods around the hollow for Alistair Sullivan. Rewards were posted, but the man and his monstrous secrets had melted into the wilderness. Elias's recovery was slow. The physical wound healed, but the scars on his soul ran deeper. He couldn't sleep without hearing the clink of chains, without seeing the hollow eyes of the children in the basement. He visited them often in the makeshift hospital set up in the town hall. He saw the progress, the weight they slowly regained, the color returning to their cheeks, the tentative smiles. But he also saw the shadows that lingered in their eyes, the flinch at sudden noises, the nightmares that made them cry out in the night. The trauma was woven into them, a part of their being now. He became their protector, their advocate. He fought with the county officials to ensure they were not just returned to their families, many of whom were too poor or broken to care for them properly, but given proper care, education, a chance at a real life. He used his small savings, his reputation, his sheer stubborn will to build a home for them. A real home, on the outskirts of Lynchburg, away from the whispers and the pitying stares. He called it the Haven. He never married again. Clara's memory was a quiet comfort, but his heart belonged to the 47. He was their guardian, their father figure, the man who had walked into hell and brought them back. Years passed. The Haven flourished. The children grew. Some learned trades. Some went to school. Some, inevitably, carried their darkness with them, struggling with the ghosts of the basement. But they had each other. They had Elias. Alistair Sullivan was never found. Some said he died in the wilderness, consumed by his own madness. Others whispered that he'd fled south, or even overseas, to continue his work in some other forgotten corner of the world. But Elias never believed he was gone. He felt it, sometimes on the edge of sleep, a faint, familiar hum, a sense of being watched from the deep woods. He kept a pistol by his bed. He taught the older children at the Haven how to defend themselves. He knew the evil hadn't been destroyed. It had only been driven back into the shadows. One autumn evening, many years later, an old Elias Thorne sat on the porch of the Haven, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Most of his children were grown now, with families of their own, but many still visited, drawn by the bond forged in that terrible basement. A little girl, his great-granddaughter, the daughter of one of the rescued children, sat on his lap, her head resting against his chest. "Grandpa," she asked, her voice soft, "is it true? About the bad man in the basement?" Elias looked out at the peaceful fields, at the sturdy walls of the Haven, at the faces of his family. He thought of the 47 pairs of eyes that had looked at him with such desperate hope in the darkness. He thought of the song they had sung, a song of defiance that had broken a monster's hold. "Yes, child," he said, his voice rough with age but steady. "It's true. But you know what's more true?" "What?" "That light is stronger than darkness. That love is stronger than fear. And that no chain, no matter how heavy, can hold a soul that refuses to be broken." He held his great-granddaughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his own. The shadows of Blackroot Hollow were long, but here, in this place of healing, the light held. And for now, for this moment, that was enough. The story of the Sullivan basement was a scar on the land, a warning whispered on the wind. But the story of the 47, and the man who saved them, was a testament to the enduring power of courage and compassion. And that story, Elias knew, would be told for generations to come.